I do believe this story is going to be the first Star Trek story I've done on this series, I think. It's definitely my first Voyager story. So the story is called Little Pink Hawks That Can Pop All Over Our Heads, But Will Keep Our Cool. I'm assuming those are song lyrics. The author is Lodessa. This is an archive of our own story. So the rating is teen and up, has no warnings, it's male-female relations. Fandom is Star Trek Voyager. The relationship in this story is Chakotay and Captain Janeway. And the additional characters aside from those two are 7 and 9, Tom Paris and the Doctor. Additional tags, Rit's name, soulmate, identifying marks, soulmates. Okay. So this was published back in June of 2015. The word count is 4,102 words, so this is a one-shot, a long one-shot, but a one-shot. 39 comments, 565 kudos, and 38 bookmarks, and it has 7,025 hits. Right, let's read the summary. After contact with an alien race whose soulmates' names are unexplainably written on their wrists, the command team must deal with the consequences as the same happens to the crew. Notes, much thanks to Sophia Helix, who helped me develop the story, even though this isn't her fandom, and Trekker Poet 29 for constantly reassuring and encouraging me through the process of writing it. Well, at least I know this story won't be like mind-scarring like the last one was. Again, I do apologize for that atrocious review. I just honestly didn't know what to say about that story. It was a good story. It was a good story, but it was very, mind-scarring, to say the least. So let's not waste any time. The crew's distraction has reached an untenable level. Over the last 48 hours, they've spent most of their time in focus staring at one another, hoping to get a glimpse of the names which have appeared on each of our wrists, rather than their duties. I've been forced to institute a change to uniform standards aboard Voyager for the time being, to include gloves obscuring the affected area. Oh, I think that was supposed to be Janeway. I think I can do a Janeway impression. So we'll try with her next line of dialogue. As the sound of her ready room door chiming interrupted Catherine, she quickly paused the recording of her log. "Come in," she called, trying to keep the harried tone out of her voice. Making no attempt to hide her relief when it was Chakotay who entered, she smiled tiredly and let out a deep sigh. "I don't suppose the doctor has made any progress on figuring out and correcting whatever this business is." "I'm sorry to have to report that your suspicions are correct. Additionally, no fewer than 3 crew members burst into tears in the middle of their shifts in the last hour. I also had to discipline another set of ensigns caught making out in the turbo lift on the way back over here." I know that sounded nothing like Chakotay, so you just have to deal with it. "I'd ask who, but honestly, I don't want to know." Catherine stood and walked over to stare out the window. Without looking, she could sense Chakotay's movement to follow her, though he stopped about half a meter behind her. His presence was a comforting warmth. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment here. I honestly thought that Chakotay and Janeway were going to be a couple in Voyager, so I was rather surprised when they had him be with 7 of 9. And obviously, judging by what happens in Picard, that didn't work out now, did it? No, it certainly didn't. "We'll get through this, Catherine. I'm sure the doc will come with something soon, probably involving 7's nanoprobes." She couldn't help smiling when he added that last bit. It really did seem as though lately all of the doctor's solutions involved nanoprobes. Of course, that was why Chakotay had said it, as always. He was trying to lift her spirits. "I'm surprised he hasn't started forcing us all to get inoculated with them regularly." She chuckled softly, turning back around to face him and finding his. I don't get it. His face, exactly where she'd known he would be. Or him. I don't know. That was just a little weird. I could just be reading it wrong. She watched him awkwardly tug at the glove of his left hand, just the way he usually tugged at his ear when he was hesitating, and looked down, only to find she was doing the same. Laughter bubbled up inside of her. This whole situation was absurd. The situation was absurd, and yet she hadn't had to look down at her wrist to know what would be written there, and she was fairly certain Chakotay didn't need to take off those gloves for her to know what was inscribed on his. The crew was a wreck, and dealing with them was giving her a headache, but she was finding that, for her personality, the mark on her wrist was turning out to feel strangely comforting. "Catherine?" he asked, apparently not sure what to make of her outburst. "It's such a bizarre problem. Names randomly appearing on people's wrists. Still, the distraction to the crew is very real." "I did draw up the schedules you asked for, putting shifts down to a skeleton crew to minimize distraction." "And?" "I'm not sure it is a good idea. Won't more time off just give people more time to think and obsess about the situation?" "You may be right, but what else can we do, Chakotay? I can't just do nothing." "Do you want me to have the senior staff brainstorm ideas? I know this whole thing must make you uncomfortable." "Why?" she asked, catching the hint of bitterness in his voice. "Maybe because you hate unexplainable phenomena." He hesitated. "Or?" "Perhaps the explanation we initially makes you... Oh, I'm sorry. Perhaps the explanation we got initially makes you uneasy." "Soulmates," she mused. "It sounds an awful lot like fate, doesn't it?" "I suppose that's a matter of perspective. Does one consider the force of gravity or the rules of genetic fate merely because they are inconceivable?" Did I say that right? Incontrovertible. I don't know if I said that right. He smiled, but she knew it was for her benefit, not out of enjoyment. He seemed tense, uneasy. "How do you feel about this whole thing, Chakotay?" she inquired, trying to decipher his mood. "Are you sure you really want my opinion?" His eyes darted back to hers, seeking something. Of course, suddenly she realized what he must be thinking. It should have occurred to her earlier that he would assume she'd resent this. She needed to put him at ease. They had enough to deal with without that. I lost my place. It scrolled up at the last minute on me. Okay, I found it. "Yes," she told him, decisively pulling first one and then another glove off before taking his hands in hers, her palms up and the ink-like marking on her skin clearly visible to him. "I always want your opinion, Chakotay." She watched his eyes glue themselves to her wrists, saw them follow the curve of the letters from the gentle bend of the letter C to the flourish of the Y. Finally, he pulled his hands back to pull off his own gloves, before entwining his fingers with hers, their names pressed together as their wrists kissed. Although I do have a question. Isn't she supposed to be married? Was she supposed to be married? It's been ages since I've seen Voyager. "I've been worried about your reaction, Catherine," he admitted. "I'm surprised that you would show me." "Why?" she asked. "I feel certain you knew what mine said as surely as I knew what yours did." She saw a smile flit across his face at the admission and squeezed her hands lightly. "I didn't expect you to be okay with it. You've seemed so annoyed about this whole thing, and you've always avoided the topic," she filled in. "Look, Chakotay, we don't really have time to talk about what this does or does not mean right now, but I need you to know that I'm okay with it. I don't want you worrying about me being upset. Can you do that for me?" "If you really are." He paused. "Don't tell me that just to put my mind at ease." "I really am," she assured him. "And I promise we will talk about it once we've gotten the rest of the crew under control." He nodded, releasing her hands and replacing his gloves. "Well then, what would you like me to do in the meantime, Captain?" "Have wild and crazy sex with me, Chakotay." Okay, she didn't really say that. She didn't really say that. I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist. I always shipped them. I was rather disappointed when they had him be with 709, because it just came out of nowhere. "I like your idea of having the senior officers make suggestions. Have them send Have them send them in. Shouldn't it say have them sent in? Though, I don't want to risk having an in-person meeting right now. Any particular reason? Chakotay raised his eyebrows in inquiry. I guess that means you haven't seen what Tom Paris's wrist says yet. She smirked playfully. Are you going to tell me? Not now, she decided. But why don't you come by my quarters for dinner later and we can trade stories? All right, he nodded. At dinner then. I'll see you then. In the meantime, I'm going to go see if I can't get the doctor to accomplish something. Don't be surprised if he spends half the time bemoaning how left out he feels because whatever this isn't affecting him. Chakotay warned. She rolled her eyes at that. Thanks for the warning. Of course, he winked. Heading towards the door, not leaning, that was my bad. I'll see you tonight. Catherine ran into half a dozen crying or fighting crew members on the way to sickbay and wondered how long this was going to be going on and how long it would take them to adjust if that just turned out to be an extended period. It turned out that Chakotay was right and the doctor was in a spiral of self-pity, and she half-heartedly considered whether it would be possible to disable the subroutine without unbalancing the rest of his personality programming. The rest of the senior staff were not in much better shape. She found B'Elanna running a kickboxing program angrily. Harry had locked himself in his quarters. Tom was nowhere to be found. Even Tuvok seemed subdued. Catherine decided to go to astrometrics in hopes of finding Seven in a more rational and scientific state of mind. Unfortunately, instead she found her staring at her own wrists intently. It keeps changing. Pardon? Catherine asked, walking towards the younger woman. The name on my wrist. It keeps changing. Seven repeated, seemingly perplexed. Everyone else's seems to remain fixed. Interesting. Catherine mused. Perhaps if we can figure out what the difference is, that might help us identify exactly what's going on here. She reached her hand out and Seven placed her arm across it, allowing Catherine to examine it more closely. Sure enough, as she watched, the letters written there blurred and shifted. Presumably it has something to do with my having been Borg, Seven pointed out. Indeed, she had to agree. The question is, what? I think perhaps we should look at the bioscans the doctor has of you in comparison to some other members of this crew, and look at the physiological differences. Your theory is sound, Seven acknowledged. I will report to sickbay. Please ask the doctor to inform me if the two of you discovered anything. Yes, Captain, Seven confirmed. Sorry about that. Sometimes I need to make sure I'm doing the right voice for the right character. Catherine finally located Tom hiding under the Delta Flyer with a bottle of synthethol. Thomas Engine, Susan. Eugene, not Engine. That was my bad. Thomas Eugene Paris, you get yourself pitying behind out from under there or I'll call security and have them haul you out, she threatened, not completely insincerely. Honestly, of all the times for Tom to go into one of his spirals, this was not the best. What are you going to do, put me in the brig? Tom sounded like a petulant child, and she responded to him accordingly. Worse, I'll have the doctor give you a hypo that will sober you right up. Captain! Tom whined in the exact tone one might whine Mom. Now, Tom, I don't have all day. She tapped her foot for emphasis. Finally, Tom emerged, red-faced and disheveled. What do you want? He slared. You to stop acting like an overgrown child having a temper tantrum and to do your job, or is that too much to ask? Tom, to his credit, at least had the decency to look embarrassed. I'm sorry, this whole soulmate thing. And then, Harry. Catherine sighed, her fondness for Tom overcoming her annoyance. Did it ever occur to you that, even if this whole thing has some greater significance, it isn't necessarily sexual or romantic in nature? After all, you and Harry are very close. Tom seemed to perk up at her words, like a puppy being reassured after chastisement. Go take a shower and sober up, Tom. I wasn't kidding about needing you on task. I also need you to get the beta shift into working order. Half of them are distracted or distraught, If we get into trouble like this, we will be sitting ducks." "Yes, Captain." Tom saluted sloppily, and she shook her head before walking away to pull Harry out of his quarters. It took far longer than she would have liked, but eventually Catherine managed to get the majority of her officers back to work and was able to head back to her quarters within half an hour left to spare before she was supposed to have dinner with Chakotay. He arrived just as she was lighting the candles, and she saw him survey the room and heard for signs of her state of mind, saw him note the fact that she wasn't wearing the gloves, that she'd put one of his favorite audio recordings. "So, this is a work dinner, or?" "A little of both, perhaps. I need you to fill me in on your last couple of hours, but that's not why I invited you." "I recall you promised me a story about Tom." He grinned, following her over to the table. "I did," she confirmed. "But first, tell me how you managed to get B'Elanna out of the holodeck." "Oh, but first tell me. Okay. We'll just skip that line." "I did." He flashed her a dimpled smile as he sat down and removed his own gloves. "And I even did it without bloodshed." "Some people might call that a miracle." She chuckled. "But surely not the rational scientist, Captain Janeway," he teased. "No, I'm going to attribute it to your superior tactical approach." Kind of slipped up in my own accent there, sorry. "So, Tom?" "He's got Harry's name on his wrist." She couldn't help stifle a giggle with her hand. She watched Chakotay struggle with the laughter that was threatening to overtake him. "Well, that certainly is elucidating. How did you talk him out of the bottle?" "I pointed out to him that there wasn't any reason soulmates couldn't be platonic." "Clever." That's not dialogue, Susan. His smirk twisted sideways as he slowly pulled back from where he'd been leaning across the table, expression falling. "Is that why you aren't freaking out then? Are you?" He trailed off sadly, tugging at her heart with his crestfallen face, perhaps despite his effort to be casual about it. "Oh, Chakotay," she murmured, reaching out to trace the lines of her name on his wrist lying across the table. "I'm sorry, Catherine. I shouldn't have." Chakotay moved to pull back, but she captured his hand with her own. "That's not what I think is happening here, Chakotay." She attempted to reassure him. I think you know better than to believe that." I try never to assume I know what's going on in that mind of yours." Catherine watched his face soften, dimples appearing as his thumb rubbed circles against her palm. "Fair enough." She bit her lips, eyes searching his. "Would you like me to tell you, then, what I believe?" "If you don't mind telling me," he replied, as always worried more about her feelings than his own. "I wouldn't have offered if I did." She smiled, reaching her free hand out to caress the side of his face. "Chakotay, I don't know what it is that is causing this phenomena, and I don't know if it has any meaning. But I do know that the part of me that entertained the notion that it might be true, that our bodies could reveal such a thing as soulmates. I know that the part of me which believed such a thing believed it would be your name I would see when I looked down at my wrist." She watched his eyes light up at her words, the tension fade from him. "I felt the same way. Maybe that's how it works. Our deepest beliefs made tangible." That's a good theory. Maybe we can figure out some way to test it. Right now, though, I hope I've made myself clear." "Only if you are." He paused, to swallow nervously. "Only if you are telling me that you love me." She struggled to find the words. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, I do, of course." I think she meant to write saying, not staying. She added hastily as she watched the joy vanish from his face. "But I was trying to say something beyond that." "That I'm your soulmate?" He grinned, almost daring her to contradict him. "I'm not certain such a thing exists, to be honest," she confessed. "But I believe that we have between us. This must be what it would be like, the whole soulmate thing, if it was real." "I think perhaps with things like this, belief might be the only thing that matters." She couldn't help smiling At that, standing and walking around the table to him, Chakotay stood facing her. "That's very existential of you," she pointed out. I hesitate to ask, but you want to know if this changes anything. If now that I've told you how I feel, I'm willing to take it a step further. I know there are reasons. There are always reasons, she sighed, placing her hand on his shoulder and feeling its reassuring solidity beneath her fingertips. If you want to pretend this conversation ever happened, he offered. No, she said definitively. Right now, there is too much chaos going on to figure out exactly how to proceed, but pretending seems counterproductive. All right, I'll follow your lead. He gazed at her with soft intensity, one hand reaching up to brush her cheek gently with his knuckles as he swept away a stray strand of hair from her face. Catherine pushed herself onto her toes, leaning in slowly, thinking that perhaps words were the incorrect medium to communicate in this moment. 709 to Captain Janeway. Her communicative reverberated, stopping her process short mere millimeters from Chakotay's lips. Regretfully, she stepped back. This is Janeway. Captain, there is something I think you should see. I'm in the Wild Man's quarters. The Wild Man's quarters? I don't remember. Or maybe that's a nickname she has for one of the... I don't remember that person. All right, I'll be right there. She sighed, squeezing Chakotay's shoulders. Should I come with you? He asked. At least until we hear of some other fire that needs to be put out. Who knows? Maybe this won't take long, and we will even get to finish our dinner. That really would be a first, he chuckled. They found 7 with Naomi Wildman. Okay, so I guess it is a real person. As promised, in mid-Caddiscock game. Naomi Wildman, show the captain your wrist, 7 instructed, and Catherine immediately saw what had drawn 7's interests. Just like 7, Naomi's wrists were in a constant state of flux. Perhaps it isn't a Borg thing after all, she commented. An idea occurred to Catherine, and she tapped on her comm badge. Janeway to Tuvok. Yes, Captain. I thought of a question I want to ask the locals about this names on the wrist business after all. See if you can get them on the line before we get out of communications range and patch it through to sickbay. Right away, Tuvok acknowledged. You two, I want you in sickbay so that the doctor can see if he can find any commonalities between you that the rest of us don't share. Chakotay, I want you to start checking the rest of the crew. Let's see if there are any other variances. So much for dinner. He shook his head. I'll let you know as soon as I find anything. As she walked by him, she patted his shoulder, wanting him to know that she was thinking the same thing. A few hours later, she learned that, according to the Neri, children's soulmates were not set until they've reached adulthood, and so the shifting names was standard. Still, she didn't know why, and the doctor didn't seem any closer to finding the answer. Chakotay found her going over her reports in her ready room at 300 hours. Her first instinct was to tell him that one of them should be getting some rest, but then he replicated her some coffee without trying to convince her of the same, and she found that she was glad that he had ignored her instructions. No one else seems to have the shifting names, he reported, clearly having spent the entirety of the night completing the task she had set him to. Other than Naomi and 7, and of course the doctor, everyone else has a fixed lettering. Catherine gestured for him to sit down across from her, and he did. I'm not sure who's supposed to be talking here. So, I'm going to pretend. I don't know. Okay, so hold on. So this line is her, him, her, him. Okay, so I think I know the order. The Neri say that the children have fluid lettering because they have not yet come into themselves, and so it is possible to know who will match a soul that hasn't finished forming yet. I'm just trying to figure out why 7 would be considered a child by the standards of whatever this is. Think about your own explanation. Children are still figuring out who they are as individuals. Isn't the same true for 7? Her body might have grown while she was in the collective, but her identity, what might be called a soul, isn't that what you've been trying to help her develop here on Voyager? I suppose you're right. She realized something, standing and pacing around her desk. It can be confusing to try to figure out how to regard Seven. Physically and intellectually, she is fully formed, but you are right that when it comes to her psychological state, she is less developed than many children. You've always had such a better idea of how to approach her than I have, Chakotay. Again, that's not dialogue, Susan. Chakotay shrugged. I do find this revelation intriguing, however. How so? She asked, perching herself from the desk facing him. I think back to our conversation about whether there was an overtone of fate to this whole business. And if one's soulmate isn't decided at birth, if it's the choices we make, the people we decide to become, well then it seems less like destiny and more like self-determination, doesn't it? There's something you want to say, isn't there, Chakotay? She reached out and pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart beat against her hand. I don't know who's supposed to be talking here. Is it supposed to be her? I think it's supposed to be her. Yes, let's do a British Janeway. I chose you if I got to decide. I just didn't know how it would be your name. I wanted it to be. Okay, I'll read it like normal Janeway the next thing. She leaned in, setting her coffee cup down to bring her lips towards his. He moved to meet her halfway, but as if on cue, the red alert siren sounded just as they were about to touch. Catherine groaned in frustration, sliding off the desk and heading towards the door to the bridge, knowing Chakotay was right behind her. Report. She might have snapped a little more shrewishly than she had intended. Then again, when she discovered just the kind of petty anonymous sensor reading that the Gamma shift had panicked over, she considered that maybe she should have been more harsh. However, it was less than 10 minutes later when the doctor summoned her to medical, saying he thought he'd figured it out. She supposed that the untimely interrupting had saved her from a potentially far more so on. I've isolated it at last. The source is a fungus, albeit a rather unusual one. It reacts to brainwaves. Fascinating. Okay, that sounded nothing like the doctor. Catherine knew she should have praised him for the good work and had been interested in the details. She wasn't, though. Bottom line, can you cure it? Why, yes, I should be able to administer a treatment in about 2 hours, though it may take up to a week for the markings to fade completely. Great. Have Tuvok give you a log of incidents since this started, and start with those crew members who've been expressing emotional distress. Spinning away from the doctor and towards the door, she smiled casually at Chakotay, raising one eyebrow. Commander, what do you say to an early breakfast in place of that dinner we never ended up having last night? Lead the way, he replied, unable to hide his grin. They barely made it to the turbolift before collapsing in laughter, her arm against his chest and his hand on her upper arm. Do you think he noticed anything? She asked finally, regaining her breath. I doubt it. He was probably too busy being upset about you not rationalizing over his genius. Someone is going to notice eventually, though. Probably, but then again, what makes you think they haven't already? What are you suggesting? That the connection between us has been evident for some time, but there is no reason for anyone to believe that how we are handling that has changed, unless you want it to. They paused, exiting the turbolift and moving towards her quarters, his hand lightly touching her lower back. It was something he'd done many a times before, but right now it promised so much more. It took all of her self-control to not continue the conversation until the door slid safely closed behind them. And just how are we handling it now? Catherine let her voice come out low and teasing. I thought I might start by officially declaring. Catherine cut him off, not willing to risk delay and chance of being interrupted a third time. As she pressed her lips firmly against his, she felt his hand run softly over her hair as he returned the kiss, a slow, sensationless kiss that they finally pulled out of short breath. And that I love you, Catherine. He remembered to finish. I love you, too. She found she was always interrupted by a yawn which escaped her. You must be so tired. I bet you haven't slept since this whole thing began, he correctly surmised. I'm so sorry, Chakotay. We finally have time and, well, I think I have gotten 15 minutes passed out over a pad. She couldn't help laughing. I should let you rest. As much as she wanted to argue, Catherine knew they were both exhausted. "Only on the condition that you stay," she evacuated, taking his hand in his. "That way we can finally have our breakfast after a nap." "How could I possibly say no to that request?" He grinned. "And when I say breakfast," she drawled, walking towards the bedroom with him trailing behind her, "I mean sex. Just so we are clear." "Crystal," he murmured against her ears, walking up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Well, that was actually a rather cute story. Again, like I have said before, I always shipped Chakotay and Janeway. It made absolutely no sense that they had him be with 7 of 9. It just made absolutely no sense. And obviously it didn't work out because of, well, for those who have watched the show Picard, you will know why it didn't work out. Because not Janeway. 7 of 9 is on that series. And, well, let's just say she does have a partner. For those who know, you know. For those who don't, well, I'd recommend that if you're a homophobe, don't watch it because you're not going to like it. Right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Please be sure to leave a like and leave a comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, cheerio.